Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a systems deep dive into Rebecca Solnit's profoundly influential book, Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities.
And this book, it asks a question that it feels absolutely fundamental right now in the 21st century.
It really does. It's about political and environmental engagement. I mean, how do
Yeah.
we continue to act vigorously with energy
Yeah.
when you're facing these monumental systemic crises?
Right, we're talking about things like climate collapse, the grinding weight of global inequality.
The steady decay of democratic systems.
Yeah.
So what is the actual sort of operational function of hope in that landscape? What does it do?
That function, as Solnit defines it, it's just so critical right now. We live in this era that's marked by this deep, almost paralyzing uncertainty.
And information overload.
Yes, exactly. A constant stream of it that often seems, tailor-made to make you feel helpless. So in this deep dive, we're exploring why hope is necessary, but not as a passive, fluffy feeling you get from positive thinking, but as a robust intellectual and political framework, a source of fuel, really, that generates sustained long-term action.
That is the crucial distinction, and it's the one we're going to keep coming back to. Our goal here is a systems-level analysis.
Yeah.
We want to examine the hidden mechanisms of social transformation.
Yeah.
I mean, how do outcomes actually happen? How do movements get real leverage against what seem like, insurmountable odds?
And also, why are the prevailing narratives, the ones that say everything is doomed or nothing can change, why are they so often, strategically deployed by the status quo?
Exactly. We're looking past any kind of partisan advocacy or, just motivational rhetoric. We're trying to examine the intellectual architecture that underpins effective change.
Okay, so let's start with the architect herself, Rebecca Solnit. She's been called a national literary treasure, and I think that's pretty accurate.
I'd agree.
She's this passionate, really close-to-the-ground reporter, but she manages to combine the rigorous investigation of a historian with the soul and voice of a philosopher-poet.
It's a rare combination.
It is. And what I find so compelling is that, unlike so many writers who just focus on cataloging all the injustices in the world, she's fundamentally an optimist.
But a very specific kind of optimist.
Yes, one whose faith and possibility is just deeply grounded in this profound, almost exhaustive knowledge of history and past struggles. She's a prolific writer, historian, activist. I think she has 18 books to her name now.
And understanding the origins of hope in the dark is, I think, essential for grasping its urgency and its timing. Solnit originally wrote this book in 2003, early 2004.
Yeah, you really have to put yourself back in that moment.
You do. Think about that precise political climate. I mean, the massive despair that was so prevalent after 9/11.
The swift rollback of civil liberties.
And the devastating outset of the war in Iraq, which, for the anti-war movement, felt like this massive global defeat.
It was a moment that felt defined by cynicism, political paralysis, a sense that institutional power was just completely unassailable.
The atmosphere was toxic. If you opposed the war, or just the general direction the U.S. was heading, the feeling was one of profound powerlessness.
Like nothing you did mattered at all.
Exactly. So Solnit started by writing a simple essay, sort of an intellectual lifeline, really, and it immediately went viral.
Right. This was before going viral was even really a common phrase. It was circulated by email.
Widely by email, yeah. It was picked up by mainstream newspapers, and famously, it was even printed out and just distributed by hand at protests.
Wow.
That organic spread, it just demonstrated a ravenous appetite, as she put it, for an alternative narrative, something that wasn't, simple, naive cheerleading.
But also, wasn't that paralyzing gloom?
Precisely. The book speaks directly to the emotional and perceptual underpinnings of our political positions. It argues that despair is often the kind of luxury, or maybe even a weapon, against action.
So if we distill her core argument, Solnit is arguing for a radical case for a hope.
She is. And she's incredibly precise about what this hope is not.
Okay, so let's clarify that. It is not the belief that everything will just be fine, automatically, without any effort.
Correct. Nor is it some comforting guarantee for tomorrow.
Instead, she defines hope as this powerful intellectual and emotional resource, a detonator of energy for action today.
Yes. The fuel for the fight, not the prize at the end. That's a great way to put it.
And this distinction between a passive belief and an active resource seems critical to her whole system.
It is. Solnit rigorously rejects the certainty of both the facile optimist and the committed pessimist.
Okay, let's break down why certainty is the enemy here. That seems counterintuitive.
Well, the passive optimist, in Solnit's view, thinks things will all work out without their deep involvement.
So they can excuse themselves from doing the hard work.
Exactly. They believe in some kind of, benevolent force or a historical arc that's just going to fix everything. The pessimists, though, they take the opposite position.
That the outcome is guaranteed to be bad. The system's unbreakable.
Right. And therefore, they are also excused from acting vigorously. If you're doomed to lose, why would you bother sacrificing your time, your energy, your comfort?
That feels incredibly relatable. That feeling of, well, the climate crisis is just too big, my choices won't change anything. That is precisely the pessimistic certainty that leads to inertia.
It is. So Solnit's active hope is the belief that what we do matters, fundamentally, even though the consequences, the timing, the ultimate ripple effect, those are things we absolutely cannot know beforehand.
So it's an embrace of the unknown.
A full embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's a space that invites or even demands that we act now, knowing that the fight itself is the most important thing, regardless of the immediate results.
Okay, let's unpack the practical core insights that build this framework. The first one is foundational, and it's rooted in how Solnit reframes a condition we usually see as a weakness.
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty itself. Her first insight is that uncertainty is the space of action. This is the hope mechanism. Hope, as a political strategy, has to locate itself in the premise that we simply do not and we cannot know what will happen next.
Right, because if the future were fixed and known, a guarantee of salvation or a guarantee of disaster, there would be no reason to even try.
But in what she calls this spaciousness of uncertainty, there is room. Room to act, to invent, to organize.
Alone or collectively, yeah. And this is where the systems metaphor becomes really powerful. Solnit suggests that history is chaotic and complex. It's much more like weather than, say, a game of checkers.
Weather, constantly shifting, generating unpredictable dynamics, triggering unexpected opposites.
Exactly. Not like checkers, which is predictable, linear, and has a clear end. We tend to demand that clean, linear causality of checkers from history, but history just never provides it.
So the moment you acknowledge that utter unpredictability of history,
you realize that the struggle for justice should never be abandoned, because the overwhelming power of the opposition is constantly, throughout history, proving vulnerable to moral fervor, to dogged determination, and collective ingenuity.
But isn't that deeply unsatisfying for the average person who wants to see political change? I mean, we crave metrics. We crave assurance. We want to know that if we protest this thing on Tuesday, it will actually change by Friday.
Of course.
If we embrace uncertainty, we're sacrificing that immediate, satisfying feedback loop.
And that is precisely the sacrifice that this kind of hope demands. It demands we act without the reward of certainty. But the payoff is the energy it unleashes. Think about the profound psychological burden that's lifted when you stop trying to predict the future and you just start inhabiting the present fully.
So much political despair is rooted in fear of the future.
Exactly. Hope says, I don't know the future, but because it is unknown, I am free to dedicate myself to the best possible outcome right now.
And that leads directly into the second insight, which is about leveraging history itself to combat that political paralysis. The paralysis that's often induced by that feeling that, things have always been this way.
Right. Insight 2. Memory counteracts systemic despair. Solnit memorably states that memory produces hope in the same way that amnesia produces despair.
And that is a crucial system dynamic, isn't it? The status quo benefits immensely when we forget just how much things have changed.
And, critically, how those changes came about.
Right.
Amnesia, in a political context, isn't just a personal failure to remember. It's a structural tool. It reinforces the belief that the current world order, whatever its flaws or injustices, is immutable, inevitable, fundamentally invulnerable.
If we forget past struggles and past victories, the system just seems unassailable, like a force of nature rather than a human construct.
And we adjust to current reality so quickly, don't we? We forget the radical nature of the very recent past.
Absolutely.
Solnit highlights some specific examples, like many people don't remember that before the economic shifts and policy changes of the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s, widespread, visible homelessness was largely absent in the United States.
That massive social crisis was not inevitable. It was created by specific policy choices.
Exactly. Or think about the environmental movement in the 1960s, when rivers were literally catching on fire from unregulated industrial pollution.
A scenario that seems completely unimaginable today, but it was reality just a few generations ago.
It was. and the profound shift in the legal and cultural landscape around workplace sexual harassment,
Yeah.
which for decades was just an accepted part of life for so many women.
These transformations, from burning rivers to legal protections, they didn't just happen. They were the result of sustained, often thankless, collective action.
But because they're normal now, we forget the revolutionary effort that they required,
And so knowing the past, including those past victories,
which are so often minimized or completely forgotten once they become part of the status quo.
it restores a sense of collective power.
It does. Solnit provides these excellent examples of forgotten victories, like the tenacious activism that led to the successful shutting down of the Black Mesa coal mines in 2005. This was a critical win because those mines were draining vast amounts of water from sacred Hopi and Navajo lands.
Or the long, valiant struggle that ultimately led to East Timor's independence from Indonesia in 2002.
Yes, these struggles just vanish from the news cycle once they're won. And that deprives future activists of crucial evidence that profound transformation, even against military dictatorships or corporate giants, is actually possible.
Which brings us to a fundamental paradox of activism. It's the realization that victory itself is often incomplete, it's unheralded, and it's certainly not a final destination.
Right. Insight 3, the victory of the unfinished struggle. Activists are often afraid to acknowledge victories
Why is that?
because they worry people will stop fighting. They mistakenly believe that victory is the end of the road, a kind of secular equivalent of paradise.
But Solnit argues that's fundamentally flawed.
Deeply flawed. Victory is instead a crucial milestone. It's an injection of momentum. It's encouragement to keep going. It's proof that the machine can be stopped, not that the work is finished.
So we have to be willing to embrace the paradox of partial progress.
We have to. If you define success as a single perfect outcome, you will always be disappointed and eventually paralyzed. Solnit uses the powerful, classic analogy of the 77-cent victory.
Let's unpack that.
We acknowledge that women earning 77 cents to the male dollar is objectively better than the 66 cents it might have been historically.
Yeah.
It's a measurable improvement, a victory for those who fought for it.
But it is fundamentally still not good enough.
Exactly. The struggle continues, but that gain provides momentum and validation.
So if we apply that to a grand historical scale, the overthrow of South African apartheid was a monumental moral and political victory. Nobody would deny that.
Of course not.
But Solnit observes that economic justice, deep racial inequality, land reform, those remain critically unfinished.
Precisely. It was a massive, necessary 77-cent victory. If you only focus on the 23 cents that are missing, you erase the struggle that won the 77 cents. And if you celebrate the 77 cents as the end, you betray the future.
It's a perpetual state of moving toward the horizon.
It is. The writer Eduardo Galeano captured this so perfectly. He said, "Utopia is on the horizon. When I walk 2 steps, it takes 2 steps back. I walk 10 steps, and it is 10 steps further away. What is utopia for? It is for this, for walking."
Hope is the determination to keep walking, knowing that the goal is the movement itself.
Right. And that focus on movement forces us to reevaluate the very nature of political cause and effect, especially when we're dealing with these long-term systemic problems.
Which is her fourth insight, the power of indirect and invisible effects. Solnit emphasizes that change is often slow, circuitous. Its effect is delayed or indirect. We frequently fail to see the impact of our actions because the cause and effect relationship isn't immediate or easily traceable.
Especially not by a media system that demands these clean, linear, measurable narratives.
Right.
We need to think of change less like a lever and more like a vibration. Solnit tells this fascinating anecdote about an activist in the Women's Strike for Peace movement during the Cold War. This woman felt profoundly foolish and futile, standing alone in the rain, protesting nuclear proliferation at the White House one dreary morning.
I can imagine just the ultimate feeling of, what is the point?
Exactly. One person, isolated, facing the monolithic machinery of the state. But years later, she learned that Dr. Benjamin Spock, the hugely influential pediatrician and family expert.
The guy who went on to become a highly visible anti-nuclear activist.
That's the one. He was spurred to action precisely because he spotted that small, committed group of women protesting in the rain that day. He saw their dedication and realized that if they were out there, the issue was real and it demanded action from public figures.
Wow. So that is the crucial systemic mechanism. It's always too soon to calculate effect. The single solitary action that feels small and worthless can be the invisible turning point that catalyzes a massive shift years later.
And the biggest shifts often happen subtly. They accumulate beneath the surface through cultural and ideological work before a visible breakthrough occurs. Think about the long incremental changes in public discourse and private life around LGBTQ+ rights that preceded the landmark Supreme Court rulings on marriage equality.
Right, the courts only ratify changes that have already happened in the minds of the people.
They're almost never where social change begins. Change begins in the minds of people, migrating from the margins to the center, often through these invisible, nonlinear effects.
So if external victory is often invisible, we must be talking about an internal process too. What does Solnit say about the psychology of people who choose despair in the face of a systemic crisis?
That brings us to a really significant critique of the psychology of resistance. Insight 5. Despair as indulgent safety.
Indulgence, that's a strong word.
It is. She argues forcefully that political despair often functions as a form of fatigue or indulgence. She calls it more predictable and, in a sad way, safer.
Safer how?
Because by concluding you're doomed to lose, you excuse yourself from the obligation to act vigorously. Despair demands less of us. It's a closed loop that requires no effort.
It's a preemptive surrender that can feel intellectually rigorous. You can marshal all the arguments about why the opposition is too strong, the systems are too entrenched, why history is against you.
Right. But authentic hope, by contrast, requires clarity, imagination, and a willingness to step into the unknown to see what lies beyond the current, seemingly immutable situations. When we choose despair, we're often choosing a form of self-protection.
Protecting ourselves from the pain of effort that might fail. Using cynicism as a shield against potential heartbreak.
Exactly. And Solnit argues this is a luxury afforded to people who are not in immediate existential peril.
And this choice, this despair, is amplified by another mechanism she identifies.
Yes, the mechanism of manufactured fear and displacement. Fear is a major tool deployed by the powerful to keep the public isolated and seduced into helplessness. Solnit notes this bizarre pattern where those who are often the most safe and comfortable, like suburbanites, are frequently the most fearful.
And that fear gets displaced. It's redirected from the true systemic dangers like social decay, rising inequality, environmental disaster onto safe dangers.
Exactly. It's psychologically safer to worry obsessively about some fictionalized external threat or to portray nonviolent activists as dangerous radicals than it is to acknowledge that the status quo is unjustifiable and vulnerable to radical change.
So the ability to critically assess the world, to see the good and the bad, the progress and the danger, all at the same time,
is the foundation of useful hope. It rejects the simplicity of either apocalyptic gloom or naive optimism.
And finally, as a powerful counterpoint to that gloom, Solnit emphasizes the role of emotion in sustained political action.
Which is her 6th insight, joy as an act of insurrection.
That's a fantastic phrase.
It is. And she draws heavily from her subsequent work on disaster response, A Paradise Built in Hell, where she notes the passionate joy and deep sense of community that emerges during times of disruption. People are often calmer, more resourceful, profoundly altruistic and creative in those moments.
They return to what she calls their fullest, most powerful selves when the usual systems of control temporarily dissolve.
So joy, in this context, doesn't betray activism. It sustains it. When the political environment tries to make you fearful and isolated and competitive, the sense of connection and deep human joy you find in collective action is an initial, fine act of insurrection.
So activism itself becomes a source of hope.
Because it constitutes an alternative reality. It's a deliberate turning away from the corruption at the center to face the wild possibilities at the edges. And that process is inherently joyful.
So if we're going to act on this active hope, we need a clear systems map of where political power actually lies. Because, as she argues, it's often intentionally hidden from view.
Right. Solnit asks us to imagine the world as a kind of theater. The powerful governments, major media, transnational corporations, they occupy center stage and they command our complete attention.
But that limelight, by its very nature, is blinding. It encourages us to fix our gaze only on the formal levers of power: presidents, parliaments, CEOs.
And that completely obscures what she calls the shadowy spaces, or the backstage areas where other massive powers are at work.
The power we need to map is the power of civil society.
Yes. The sleeping giant is the general public. When we stop being mere consumers or anxious voters and we wake up, we are no longer just the audience. We become civil society, the nonviolent superpower.
And authorities fear moments like the Arab Spring or the massive global climate marches or Occupy Wall Street.
Precisely because they signify that popular power is real enough to overturn entrenched regimes and rewrite the social contract. Nonviolent means, Solnit emphasizes, are sometimes more powerful than centralized violence, more powerful than armies because they strike at the legitimacy and consensus that institutional power needs to function.
But I have to push back on that a little bit. Isn't the Occupy example also a case of popular decentralized power being pretty easily dismantled by highly centralized institutional power? I mean, doesn't Solnit address the fragility of civil society?
She does, but she reframes what success means. Occupy was dispersed, yes, but its lasting victory wasn't institutional. It was semantic and narrative.
Okay.
It introduced the concept of the 99% versus the 1% into the mainstream global vocabulary. That idea, which was radical fringe thinking just a year earlier, fundamentally shifted the way we talk about inequality in the West.
So that narrative shift is the invisible victory. It shows how power operates through a feedback loop.
Exactly. And that structural reality dictates the flow of new ideas and stories, which we can map as the narrative feedback loop. Stories migrate secretly.
New transformative ideas rarely start in the center of power.
They almost never do. They originate in the marginal zones with the young, the discounted, obscure researchers, visionaries, and frontline activists.
And these stories and concepts, they migrate toward the center, but circuitously, often over decades.
Right. And when an idea finally becomes mainstream-like widespread concern over corporate control or, historically, anti-slavery sentiments, the established narrative often claims it as common sense or inevitable progress.
Conveniently forgetting the radical origins and the struggle required to push it into visibility?
Yes. The assumption is that whatever we now believe is what we always knew, which is a mechanism to deny the revolutionary power held by the margins.
That erasure is key, isn't it? It makes it look like the current system solved the problem, rather than that the system was forced to adapt by outside pressure.
Solnit cites an activist who described this vividly as the story food chain. Controversial stories have to be inoculated first through alternative media, edgy weeklies, local public radio, or today, independent digital platforms.
Only after the story appears there, builds consensus, and proves its resilience.
Will the established, cautious newspapers or TV networks finally cover it? The powerful on center stage believe they wrote the script, but that script often originated decades earlier in the shadows, written by people who were dismissed.
And that narrative shift allows for a fundamental reevaluation of how change should be pursued. This leads to what she calls the revolution in revolution, non-ideology as strategy.
Yeah. Contemporary movements, like the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, and the global justice movement of the late 90s, they explicitly reject the old left's model.
The model of total victory, authoritarian vanguard structures, seizing state power.
All of it. Their new strategy is fundamentally anti-doctrinal. It favors non-hierarchical decision-making, decentralized organizing, and deep community democracy. It's flexible, collaborative, and deeply suspicious of fixed answers or rigid plans.
The means of the revolution become as important as the ends.
Which is the concept she refers to as the politics of prefiguration.
Right. Prefiguration means the movement embodies the world it aspires to now.
Exactly. If you seek democracy, your activism must be democratic. If you seek gender equality, your movement has to implement full gender equality from day one by acting as if they are free.
Or, in the Zapatista case, by affirming women's full rights and communal power from the start, defying some traditional indigenous practices.
They create what's called a temporary autonomous zone, which is a victory in itself. The focus shifts radically from institutional power gaining control of the state to the power of consciousness in daily life.
Yeah.
You win the cultural battle before the political one.
This nonlinear, prefigurative approach means activists often achieve victories that are incredibly difficult to measure because they're defined by their very absence. They look like nothing happened.
And we can call this concept the angel of alternate history, because victories are so often defined by what didn't happen. The destructive mine wasn't built, the road didn't cut through the pristine forest, the political atrocity didn't unfold.
We need a conscious, active mechanism to recognize these triumphs invisible except through storytelling.
This is a huge challenge for maintaining hope, right? If we're only rewarded by visible results, we're going to ignore our greatest successes.
So Solnit suggests we need this angel of alternate history to show us what the world would look like if we hadn't been there.
Yes. That alternate, darker timeline is the only sure way to measure the profound preventative effect of our acts. Think about the decades-long successful opposition to the MX missile program in Nevada.
Or the global wave of protest against the Iraq War in 2003.
Exactly. Solnit argues the protests likely convinced the Bush administration against the shock and awe saturation bombing of Baghdad that was being planned.
So their argument is that the protest, which was widely derided as ineffective at the time, may have averted the immediate killing of a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of lives.
That is a victory defined entirely by an atrocity that was averted. It's a miracle that leaves no trace.
And if we don't tell the story of that averted catastrophe, it just becomes history as usual.
And that's why storytelling is not just narrative. It's a critical infrastructure for hope. It makes the invisible triumphs visible, and it reinforces the effectiveness of collective action.
Okay, looking at the present day, Solnit's framework helps us understand patterns of alliance building that completely defy traditional political binaries.
It does. Let's talk about the radical center and new coalitions. Solnit suggests that the traditional political terms, left, right, liberal, conservative, are increasingly outdated. They act more as identity markers than descriptors of political goals,
And real significant change is happening in what she calls the radical center.
where groups with historically different ideologies find powerful common ground against shared systemic threats.
The case study she presents from the American West is incredibly instructive here. It involves ranchers and environmentalists.
Groups who historically saw each other as existential enemies.
Right. And they formed coalitions, like the Malpai Borderlands Group, against rapid sprawl and destructive development.
They realized that while they were squared off fighting each other over grazing rights or resource usage, developers were walking off with the valley, turning their shared landscape into subdivisions and strip malls.
They found they had far more in common: a deep love for the land, a shared desire to preserve rural livelihoods, and opposition to the destructive economics of unlimited growth than what kept them apart.
And this isn't just compromise, it's a strategic realignment. They weren't suddenly agreeing on everything, but they were agreeing on a core systemic threat that superseded their ideological differences.
And that realignment represents a massive shift from oppositional activism to what she might call peacemaking practice.
Where purist differences are set aside when the goals preserving a functioning landscape or a community are powerful enough. And you can see this today emerging in issues like data privacy or antitrust movements, where traditional progressive advocates are finding common cause with libertarian voices against the unchecked power of big tech.
The dividing line shifts from ideology to systemic control.
Exactly. And you see this local power structure dynamic so clearly when you map the conflict between corporate power versus local agency.
The largest corporations, with their vast financial resources, invest massive funds to maintain control over local politics and keep the public asleep and disengaged.
Solnit highlights the extraordinary case study of Richmond, California. In 2014, Chevron, which operates a massive refinery there, spent a lavish $3.1 million on a smear campaign to defeat progressive grassroots candidates.
And Richmond is a mostly poor, non-white city.
It is. The expenditure worked out to about $180 per voter, an unbelievable amount designed to just flood the zone and ensure their candidates won.
And Chevron lost. They lost every single race.
They did. And this demonstrated empirically that if people wake up and show up, they can successfully counter massive, highly leveraged corporate financial power. The money was irrelevant when faced with local organizing, door-to-door campaigning, and community commitment.
It was a clear, visible sign that the divine right of Chevron, as she might put it, is not inevitable.
Financial power can be neutralized by political solidarity and organizing.
Okay, let's apply these principles to the most pressing systemic crisis we face, the climate movement as a test case. This really reveals the complexity of systemic change in high-stakes scenarios.
It does. And Solnit identifies 3 key groups, or heroes, driving this movement, demonstrating that change requires a coordinated, multi-pronged approach.
The first group.
First, you have the scientists. They're providing frightening clarity about the reality of the crisis and its urgency. They perform the diagnostic function.
And second?
Second, you have the engineers. They're rapidly providing scalable economic solutions like wind and solar, which are dropping in cost faster than almost any historical technology. They provide the tools.
And third, you have the activists.
The activists who are fighting fiercely, both locally and globally, to implement those solutions and dismantle the entrenched fossil fuel economy.
So the activists are the ones who make the solutions politically viable. They move the debate from scientific possibility to political necessity.
And the implication here is profound for you, for the individual listener. Personal virtue is valuable, but it is not the solution to a systemic problem.
Right. Bicycling, clean eating, recycling. It's good for your personal conscience.
But Solnit's message is firm. Nothing less than systemic change will save us. We have to recognize ourselves not just as individual moral actors, but as participants in the system. and our most powerful act is working collectively to change that system on a colossal scale.
That shifts the focus away from individual guilt toward collective responsibility and action. And this brings us right back to the function of manufactured fear.
Solnit argues that this anxiety or fear is often deployed specifically to displace accountability and maintain the status quo. If people are kept fearful and isolated, they are susceptible to manufactured threats,
Like the constant barrage of culture wars or the fixation on safe dangers.
which distracts them from the existential danger of social decay and inequality.
And the ultimate goal of this displacement is to keep the public seduced into helplessness.
Of course, if you feel powerless against abstract manufactured threats, you are less likely to confront the real, measurable vulnerabilities of the system you live in.
So what this all means is that the ability to critically assess the world, to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time.
The sheer magnitude of the crisis A&D, the astonishing evidence of past progress.
That ability is the foundation of useful, functional hope. It is an informed discontent that arises out of saying no to deprivation and rejecting the simplicity of either absolute victory or absolute gloom. It demands clarity and moral rigor.
So what's fascinating here is how Solnit redefines the very nature of power within political systems, especially the efficacy of nonviolence versus force.
Right, power in unarmed people. She notes that nonviolent direct action campaigns have become an increasingly powerful and demonstrably effective force in the last century.
Historically, nonviolent movements often succeed against governments and militaries whose violence frequently fails, especially in achieving lasting political stability and democratization.
This suggests that the immense power we grant to centralized armed institutions
Can often be taken aback by withdrawing consent and exercising collective will.
The collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 serves as a crucial historical anchor for this idea, doesn't it?
It's the perfect example. That massive concrete wall, which seemed eternal and immutable, fell not due to military assault, but because so many unarmed people just showed up on both sides.
Demonstrating a change wrought by determination against overwhelming odds.
By acting as if they were free, the people of Eastern Europe literally created their freedom. It's the fragility of centralized power when faced with decentralized determination.
And this connects directly to the definition of systemic success in this new paradigm.
Yes, the goal is process, not product. The focus shifts radically from the old paradigm of institutional power, where success meant gaining control of the state,
To the power of consciousness and how we live now.
John Jordan, an activist Solnit references, noted that the new activism favors building the desired reality in the present, not just creating something in the future.
Which rejects the old authoritarian certainty of political righteousness. Instead of a rigid blueprint for the future, the new approach favors fluidity, collaboration, constant movement.
The Zapatistas were victorious not just in specific military or political actions, but because they established and embodied their aspirations, non-hierarchical, democratic, affirming women's full rights from the very first days of their uprising.
Their struggle became a kind of self-contained victory.
Where individual life celebrated its unification with a regenerated society, the means and the ends were congruent. So every act of organizing, every meeting, every protest that's conducted democratically and joyfully is a small, immediate victory for the world they want to create.
And finally, this entire framework leads us to reframe uncertainty as a political necessity, the value of the unfinished world.
Right. If we await a static, perfect paradise where all problems are solved, a final, fixed destination, we inevitably stop acting. That search for finality is paralyzing.
Solnit argues that the industrialized world has often attempted to approximate this static, solved paradise, maybe in the sterility of the post-war suburbs.
But that have produced soft ennui, isolation, and a decay of the soul. True hope resides in the unfinished world. She likens it to Coyote's world in some Native American myths, where creation never ends.
And that constant, ongoing creation is the ultimate source of hope because it requires our continuous participation and creativity.
Keats famously called the world, with all its suffering, this veil of soul-making. This continuous, unpredictable struggle is what fosters courage, selflessness, and deep purpose. It acknowledges that the fight itself, not the eventual outcome, is where meaning is found.
Perfection is a stick with which to beat the possible.
That's a great way to put it. Since this earth will never be heaven, our focus has to shift. It shifts from achieving total ideological victory to the incremental hard work of reducing devastation, outlawing cruelty, and undermining the systemic sources of destruction.
These are incremental, but they are profoundly true victories.
And the uncertainty of the outcome is the space in which they become possible.
So this book fundamentally changes what hope means for us. It strips away the emotional fluff and reveals it as a fierce intellectual determination. It teaches us that history is complex and nonlinear, full of surprising reversals.
And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that the biggest, most decentralized power is held by collective civil society, often acting invisibly.
We come back time and again to the essential unknowability of the future. Solnit insists that the unknown is not a vacuum of despair.
But the primary leverage point, it invites us to be astonished by miracles and unexpected change rather than paralyzed by dread.
Hope, in this sense, is not a luxury. It's a vital tool.
An axe you break down doors with in an emergency. It is a commitment to the future that fundamentally makes the present inhabitable.
And Solnit teaches us to take the long view, to look beyond the immediate outcome that the news cycle demands. There's that great line about the French Revolution, too soon to tell, attributed to Zhu Enlai.
The great line.
It reminds us that the verdict is never truly in. Our contemporary efforts are just a single, nonlinear point on an extremely long and convoluted historical path. The victories we sow today may only be reaped 2 generations from now, and that long view demands patience and stamina.
It does. And Solnit argues that how terrible the future becomes, how many wars break out, how hot the planet gets, how many species die out, is the direct measure of our action or our inaction right now. The future is dark, yes, but with the darkness as much of the womb as the grave.
Which leaves us with a truly provocative question.
What does it mean for you to view your commitment to social, political, or environmental change in whatever small capacity as your most important work right now, knowing that the outcome is uncertain, but that your action is the only thing that matters?
This has been a deep dive into Rebecca Solnit and her influential book, Hope in the Dark: Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.